Okay, we're now also live on Facebook and YouTube. So thank you to everyone who's joining us on social media. And if everyone could just keep yourself muted if you are not speaking, because we are getting some background noise, that would be great. Thank you. I'm not sure where that background noise is coming from. It was you, Becky. You were causing did anyone else hear that background noise? Yeah, okay. So just stay muted for now. Sorry. Okay.
Still hearing it.
Something is getting plugged in and out of your system, it sounds like.
I think it's my mouse. Did it stop now? Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead, I think, and get started with the introductions. So thanks to everyone for joining us. My name is Geneva Blackmer. I'm the program director for the Interfaith Center. We're located at the Miami University campus in Oxford, Ohio. And our mission is to invite people of diverse religious, spiritual, and secular worldviews to participate in one another's practices in order to cultivate appreciative understanding and to build friendships and relationships, as well as to unify them around common moral, social, and ethical concerns in order to build a more just and equitable society for all people. So really happy that you're all here with us tonight. I'm happy to welcome my friend Tahil Sharma, who is the regional coordinator for URI North America, and has been working with the interfaith movement since 2012, following the Oak Creek Gurdwara shooting in Wisconsin. Tahil also serves as the Interfaith Minister in residence for the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles and a board member for Sadhana, a coalition of progressive Hindus. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tahil.
Thank you, Geneva, and thank you to all the folks at the Interfaith Center for doing this kind of programming and making me, considered worthy enough to be able to present. Because I like to give myself the opportunity to think that, certain aspects like this can be often a challenge to present about because Hinduism is not really understood for all of the nuance that it has. So people like to kind of think they know what Hinduism is about because it's so complicated. But today I want to share with you a taste of Hinduism, but particularly some contexts about Hinduism and the way that I've been exposed to it that will be really helpful in your larger understanding of the nuance that this eternal faith or the Sanatan Dharma has to offer. So with that, I will start by sharing my screen. I'm making sure I share my sound. There we go. And I think everyone should be able to see that. So as Geneva mentioned, I am the regional coordinator for the United Religions Initiative in North America, which is the largest grassroots movement and network of interfaith grassroots organizations. We have a little over 1,070 cooperation circles or chapter organizations in 113 countries. And it gives me an opportunity to really explore what this interfaith cooperation movement really looks like, because interfaith doesn't look the same anywhere. But it's also given me an opportunity to dig deeper into my entire identity as a Hindu, a Shakta particularly, and a Hindu Sikh, which I'll get more into in just a bit. So just as a disclaimer, I am speaking as a sole individual who has had the unique intersection of experiences and upbringing and identities that make me the person that I am. So please be mindful that a lot of what I have to share may resonate with folks. It may sound familiar, and some of it may sound confusing. So let me take the opportunity to remind people that I am speaking based on my experience. And aside from being able to talk about some of the larger aspects of Hinduism as a religion, that some of my personal practices and some of what I adhere to is not something that every Hindu necessarily adheres to or practices as well, because that actually lives into the depth of what the Hindu religion actually offers, which is a lot of complexity, a lot of diversity, and an amalgamation of a lot of different practices and beliefs. So, with that, I will start off by telling the story of myself. I was born in 1992 in Los Angeles to a Hindu father and a Sikh mother. I was born into a dual religious family, having to figure out what that meant. And aside from all of the other identities that developed over time, I had to really figure out what this unique relationship I had to the divine really meant, because it meant that I had to be in two different cultural contexts. I had to study various spoken and religious languages. I had the opportunity to, participate in services on the weekends at various communities. And it also meant that I had to learn a lot of the history and baggage that comes with identifying with more than one religion, not just personal family baggage, but also the realities of how systems and communities have come to develop in the name of these religions that may have in some way some institutionalization or some way of being able to carry out societal norms. Um, and it's given me an opportunity to really think about it from the larger context of my experience as not just being someone of a dual religious background, but an interfaith activist, someone who is constantly involved in trying to fight for the rights of others who are different from me by religion, by ethnicity, by socioeconomic status, and by so much more. And it's because of the mandates from both of my traditions that I'm able to take a more informed approach of how to fight for justice. And so today, that emphasis will be coming from my understanding of Adishakti, or the primordial energy or power that exists in all of creation today. So to understand that, we first have to understand what is Hinduism. Hinduism is recognized as one of the oldest religions in the world, almost compatible with Judaism in terms of the centuries of history that it offers over thousands of years. Many of you may have heard of texts, may have heard of terms like mantras, yoga, or the word om that people use when doing meditation. And all of that has a Hindu origin. And you may have heard of similar holy texts that include the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and the list of hundreds of texts actually goes on about what informs what Hinduism is. Um, Hinduism is not as simple as a single prophet, a single book, and a single story. It is an amalgamation of thousands of origin stories, thousands of stories of morality and justice, thousands of texts that describe the experiences of the divine in multiple manifestations. And equally, it informs the way that society is able to flourish, but how at the same time it has to experience various forms of suffering to be able to come to the epiphanies that we do. And with that comes also a lot of questions of assumption. Some of those questions include things like, how many gods and goddesses do we have within the pantheon of Hinduism? What are things like the caste system and why do they exist? And why do things like the idea of the sacredness of cows exist as a relationship within, Hindu society? So I'll take an opportunity to be able to answer some of that before I get into the precise personal practice of being a Shakta, or someone who worships the feminine divine. The image that you see in front of you right now is that of the goddess Durga, who is considered the goddess of victory, or the one who overcomes adversities. Um, Seen here, she is in this painting, she is pictured attacking the god Mahishasur and killing him, representing the win of triumph over of good versus evil, and actually a very good example of the kind of approach that it takes to understand the relationship to gender and sexuality within the context of a lot of Hindu scriptures. One of the ways that we come to understand that is by understanding the role of some of the deities that we see in front of you right now. So, for those of you that may be exposed to Hinduism for the first time on this call, or may be familiar with these images, these are some of the gods and goddesses that are often portrayed as being very famous or being well worshipped within a Hindu society. On the left, you have what is known as the Trimurti, or the three main gods that sort of look over all of creation. You have the Lord Brahma, who is the god of creation. You have the Lord Vishnu, who is the god of sustenance. And you have Lord Shiva, who is the god of destruction. Next to those three images is the Tridevi, or the three goddesses or consorts of each of these gods. The goddess Lakshmi at the bottom left is the goddess of wealth. On the bottom right is the goddess Saraswati, who is the goddess of knowledge. And on the top, seated upon the lion, is the goddess Durga, also known originally in her simpler form as Parvati, who is the goddess of power. Now, you might notice a bit of a connection there with some of the things that I've described: creation, sustenance, destruction, wealth, knowledge, power. There's actually a relationship between all of that that oftentimes, unfortunately, um, school systems and even families do not acknowledge the relationship for as deep as it is. In the context of looking at, a male god with his female wife, it is usually looked as the platonic emotional relationship of having a husband and a wife together. But in Hindu mythology and in the understanding of the deep philosophy of Hinduism, there's a deeper relationship with the role that the goddesses play in the life of each of the gods on the left. So, what do you need for creation? You need knowledge. Therefore, the goddess Saraswati is paired with the god Brahma. What do you need for sustenance? Wealth, which is why the goddess Lakshmi is paired with the god Vishnu. And what do you need for destruction? Power, which is why the goddess Parvati is paired with Lord Shiva. And they don't just function as, a source of energy. They function as co-equals. You must have the male god and you must have the female goddess in line with each other to be able to have the full role performed, which is an emphasis of not only gender equity, but the ability of understanding the balance between the masculine and feminine that is very deep seated within Hindu theology. You cannot have anything male without female and vice versa. And it's very important to be able to educate people about that because many times this kind of information is not given about Hinduism. And it's mainly because of a very male dominant, patriarchal, and traditionally male way of explaining how Hinduism functions. Even when there is a major presence of the feminine divine throughout almost every aspect of Hinduism, many people do not get to hear about it as much because of the dominance of male gods in the process rather than their female consorts. So hopefully I'll have an opportunity to share more about that. This diamond here, or this gem, whatever you want to call it, is one way of being able to explain the complicated nature of Hinduism. All of the different descriptions that I made of a god that is a creator, a sustainer, a destroyer, a source of power, a source of wealth, or a source of knowledge, all can be actually explained as different facets of a single beautiful gem. That single gem being what we understand as the supreme being, or the Atman and the Brahman, or that energy that exists in all things. That single gem is how we understand the God Almighty in all of his different forms, because we all may look at this gem from different facets and find its beauty, its power, and the way we connect to it. But that's the same way we actually understand how Hinduism sees the role of these different gods and goddesses. In one temple, particularly in the city of Vrindavan, it's estimated that the listing of the different gods and goddesses of Hinduism can be measured over 330 million times over. And what that actually means is all of those 330 different manifestations and avatars and forms are actually all different aspects of a single divine entity, which we know as Brahma or as we know as Antaryami or by many other names. Um, and it's the way that we have that direct relationship with some of these singular entities and how they play a role in our lives that we understand that that facet in particular is what helps us better connect with the divine overall. So then comes the complication of something like the caste system. For many folks that may not understand the caste system for what it is definitely a system that has no less controversy than how we understand the gaps of racial injustice and socioeconomic wealth here in the United States. Because this is a system that goes back a couple of thousand years, not as old as Hinduism itself, but very much a part of what has become Hindu society in a lot of ways. So, based on the text by the sage Rishi, the sage Manu, who wrote something as the laws of Manu or the Manu Smriti, there was a system of guaranteeing rights for every aspect of communities that existed within society. And the creation of this system, known by different names in Hindi or other languages as Varna or Jati, which implies caste or placement of hierarchy within a society, meant that various communities, no matter what they were doing, would have a guarantee to rights and to be able to access and own and do things and have opportunities. What was considered or supposed to be a horizontal system ended up becoming a very vertical system where many people at the top were the only ones that benefited. And as you went down that hierarchical ladder, you were less likely to be able to prosper and thrive. And therefore, this system has informed in many ways the nature of how a society can develop a hierarchical system based on some connection to theology. So, in front of you, you have a pyramid that describes Brahmins or priests, which were considered the highest among the elite. You have the Kshatriyas, who were the warriors, because many principalities that were Hindu ruled throughout history and mythology. You have the Vaishyas or the merchants who are artisans, who are farmers, who are trained to do special kinds of handicrafts. And then you have the Shudras, or who are often referred to, unfortunately, as untouchable people, who would do the tasks of communities that were not typically done by those of the higher caste. When you have a system like this that over time gets worse and worse and worse, when it gets impacted by systems like colonialism, by power structures, by toxic masculinity and patriarchy, and then impacted on top of that by things like capitalism, you now have a system of such a wide economic wealth gap and such a wide gap of human rights that a system like this is very hard to justify. And I speak that very personally as someone who supposedly, by the telling of my own family, was born into a Brahmin family and told that I should be proud of being in this caste or in this community without being explained why and without having the relationship understood of why this system was so oppressive in its nature and in its behavior. And with this came the relationship to the indigenous communities of South Asia, known as the Adivasis, and the folks that were forced into labor, that were forced into a lot of oppressive circumstances, known as Dalits. And these are the communities that continue to fight to equalize society in a way that really calls out the nature of those at the top, or the Brahmins, and the ways that they control the power structures and the structures of society and the systems that are unjust towards them. Many of these terms might sound pretty familiar to some of the conversations we're having right now in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement. And there are some very important parallels there because of the historical realities of how systems were made to be unjust. And unfortunately, it is these kinds of systems that invite me as a Hindu to actually think about the deeper ways of deconstructing my own traditions and being able to not just disassociate with a system like this, but to actively deconstruct it and make it no more. Now, I'd like to talk about the main reason we're having our conversation today, which is the idea of Shaktism, or understanding the divine relationship or energy that is the divine feminine. And Shaktism is a tradition that goes back as old as Hinduism itself, when it started as the amalgamation of different communities and beliefs and traditions, um, as a co equal part of how we understood our relationship to the divine. So, like many parts of how we function as a quote unquote denomination, Shaktism doesn't have an exact founder. There are many leaders over time, like Swami Ramakrishna, like Swami Vivekanand, like uh, many other priests and sages who developed their theology with a focus and a centering on the Divine Mother or Adishakti. But over time, it sort of developed its own tastes and ways and beliefs of doing things that ended up making it almost come out as a denomination of its own within Hinduism. So on the very right, you'll see the central image of the goddess Lalita Tripura Sundari, which is supposed to be the most elucid form of the mother goddess. This is supposed to be the goddess Parvati, who is also known as Shakti and Durga, who manifests all of the power or all of the energy that basically runs all of existence. She's being fanned by the goddesses Lakshmi and Saraswati. She is seated upon a stool with which her husband Shiva is seated as well. And a number of other gods are seated around her to show the kind of importance and strength that she brings as being the mother that looks over all of creation. This is her in her majestic and beautiful form, as some may see it. And on the left, you may see a more gruesome form of how this mother is angry and enraged when she sees that her creation is destroying itself. And she manifests herself into the goddess Kali, or the goddess of age and time, the goddess of destruction that is there to bring creation to restart once again, because she understands the pain that her children are facing, and she can do nothing but be enraged. And therefore, she creates this form of garlands of demons' heads across her breasts, to wielding weapons that carry blood, which is a very different way of understanding our relationship to the feminine divine, which is keeping in touch with those emotions that are very hard to control, like deepening sadness, like anger, like anguish and suffering, which are equally a part of how we are supposed to understand our relationship to the Divine Mother. These are emotions that we know exist in our hearts, but that we have to build stronger relations to them so they do not cause us pain. When we look at the divine spirit of the Mother Goddess, or of Adi Shakti within us, it's almost seen as a flickering flame, like you see in the first image on the very right on some of the mud lamps. Each, each of those flames exists in all of us as a part of creation. And our responsibility is to figure out, how does that light illuminate us rather than burn us and destroy us? These are the images and relationships that we understand with the majestic form and the gruesome form of the Mother Goddess, because we understand the very active and engaging role that she plays in everything that we see happening in the universe. And to the very left is a piece of sacred geometry that we call the Sri Yantra, which is a form of, sort of using shapes and iconography in a lot of geometric ways that help us understand the energy that is associated with the idea of being connected to the goddess. So you will see these flower petals that represent different gods and goddesses. You will see these different triangles that are made out of bigger triangles. And right at the center, the Bindu, is where goddess Lalita Tripura Sundari, the goddess on the very right, is sort of seated on her throne, representing that all around it is supposed to be the enlarging engrossment of all of creation, and where she sits at the center at all times. What I'm about to play for you right now is what is known as the Gayatri Mantra. The Gayatri Mantra is considered one of the most important mantras in all of Hinduism, following the sacred syllable of Om, because it represents the idea of how we understand the divinity that exists in all things. And this mantra is actually a very interesting example of what does the feminine divine look like in various aspects of Hinduism. This mantra is seen as feminine, and it's a mantra describing the energy that exists in all things. So I'll be playing this video for a couple of minutes for you all to hear. There will be a translation at the bottom, and we'll play it out for a couple of minutes. So please be sure to listen, think, reflect, pray, or do as you feel in this time, so that we can come together to get back to the presentation and get to your questions.
रात्रि सोल से सारे अपडेट्स पाने के लिए बेल आइकन दबाइए।
तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्। ॐ भूर्भुवस्वः तत्सवितुर्वरेण्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो नः प्रचोदयात्।
So many of you who have heard this Gayatri Mantra just now have heard a very important aspect of how we understand the feminine divine. The one whose energy goes throughout all of creation, through the waters, through the heavens, and through this material universe. One whose energy is a source of joy, one whose power is the one that strengthens our hearts and heightens our intellect. This is the relationship that is deeply seated throughout all of Hinduism, but is deeply understood as our way of being able to understand the ultimate divine through the form of Adishakti, or the mother goddess in her various forms. One text that is centered to the Hindu tradition of Shakta tradition is the Sri Durga Saptashati, which is also known as the Chandi Part or the Devi Mahatmya. This is a holy text of about 700 stanzas that talks about the various qualities and important aspects of Devi, or the goddess, in her relation to all of creation. She is, considered a warrior goddess who fends off the universe from various demons. She is the goddess that is the ultimate mother. She is the goddess that reigns supreme over all of creation. And we get to hear and understand those various aspects of what that mother goddess means to us through this book. And it is a part of what is known as the Markandeya Puran, which is written by the sage Markandeya, who has a very deep respect and reverence towards the mother goddess, who we consider the source of many of these important texts. The language that is used to pray to the mother goddess can be seen in multiple regions and in multiple ways. But rooted in the Hindu tradition is the use of Sanskrit, which you'll see written throughout the text on the front cover and this first page. I'm able to read some of it. Can't translate all of it, unfortunately, because it is more complicated for me and I don't have the formal education like others do. But I can recite some of the stuff that's written here. Ya Shri Swayam Sukritinam Bhavaneshwa Lakshmi Papatmanam Kritadiyam Hridayeshu Buddhihi Shraddha Satam Kula Jana Prabhavasya Lajja Tatvam Natasma Paripalaya Devi Vishwam Tvameva Mata Chapita Tvameva Tvameva Bandhuscha Sakha Tvameva Tvameva Vidya Dravinam Tvameva Tvameva Sarvam Mama Deva Deva. So a couple of important places of worship for Hindus can be found throughout India and around the world through temples. In many spaces, including in my own home and even in my office currently, I have we have different altars that show our reverence to the mother goddess through paintings and statues, where we worship through incense and mud lamps and through the reading of scriptures and the recitation of mantras. But some of these important temples actually tell deeper stories of mythology in relationship to the mother goddess. So what you have in front of you is the city of Katra, which is based in Jammu and Kashmir, in the most northern territory in India. And this is the home of the temple of Sri Vaishno Devi. Sri Vaishno Devi is supposed to be an amalgamation of the three mother goddesses, Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth, Saraswati, the goddess of knowledge, and Kali, the goddess of destruction. Their powers together created the goddess Vaishno Devi, who was the one who slayed various demons and whose intention was to be able to remind people of the role of the feminine divine that is not in competition with, that is not fighting back, but that coalesces and is interdependent with the masculine divine. And here you will find that there is a gupa, or a cave, where you go to this special altar where you get to pray. And there's a belief of your willingness and ability to be able to go to this temple in particular, which is known as a bulava, or a calling, that if you are meant to go to this temple, nothing will stop you from going. And if you're not meant to go to the temple and see the goddess herself, that you could even be at the doorstep and not see her. And that kind of runs through the tradition of many of the communities that still live in the area of Jammu currently. This temple is famous for the goddess Kali, or the goddess of destruction that we saw earlier, the gruesome form of the mother goddess. And here is the temple of Sri Dakshineshwari Kali, basically the mother who resides in the south, and how she actually shows herself in the form as the goddess who weans and pacifies the universe. She is seen in a bit of her treacherous form, but is still seen in a very calming way to all of her devotees, because she is, at the end of the day, still the mother of the universe. And this temple is famous for founding the Ramakrishna mission after Swami Ramakrishna, who had a deep devotion to the mother goddess and was in many stories considered someone who worshipped her so much that he was willing to give her life for her. And when he tried to, she appeared to him in an apparition and said, "You don't need to do this. Go into the world to be able to preach the dharma, or the responsibility to protect the world and uplift others through my grace." And this temple, among many others, continues to worship the goddess Kali. What is interesting about Hinduism in India that I don't think a lot of folks tend to understand is the complicated relationship between how mythology and practice looks different, not just in terms of denominations, but definitely in terms of regions as well. There are very differing, mythological stories of how different goddesses and gods are represented, and something like some of the architecture that you might see is also a very good example. This is the temple of Meenakshi, which is one of the forms of the goddess Parvati, or goddess Shakti, which is based in Madurai, which is in southern India. And you'll notice the extremely ornate nature of these stupas, or basically these sort of large, towers that basically tell the various mythological stories and are not even actually a part of the main altar for some of the gods and goddesses. This is how you're welcomed into the space, with this ornate, extremely detailed way of being able to understand what mythology means to the Hindu community. And it plays an important role in how we also understand the simplicity and the complexity of what the feminine divine represents. And it reminds me of a story that I've often told when trying to make people understand how much the feminine divine is a part of Hinduism. I'll stop sharing so that I can share that story. The story goes that the god Shiva and the goddess Parvati are sitting with some of their believers at this mount. And there's a sage known as Bhringi that walks up to them. Sage Bhringi is a devotee of Shiva and Shiva only. He has no interest in wanting to associate with the goddess Parvati. So Rishi Bhringi walks up to them and only bows to the god Shiva. And Shiva says, "Why are you only bowing to me? Why are you not bowing to my wife?" And he said, "Because I only believe in you. I don't have any interest in talking to her." And he says, "Well, if you were a true devotee of mine, you would see me in her heart, and that you will see that we are inseparable as husband and wife. We, representing all of the power in the universe, cannot be separated." And he says, "I don't believe that for one bit, because you mean everything to me." So the god and goddess look at each other and they sort of smirk. And as they look back at this sage, their energies come together and develop a new deity known as Ardhanareshwar, which is the half male, half female form of both of these deities, which is supposed to represent the inseparable aspect of the masculine and the feminine divine. So in the audacious nature of this sage, mind you, this is mythology, so some things really just don't make sense. The sage becomes upset and turns into a wasp so that he can fly up to the deity and only fly over the masculine side of the deity to sort of show worship and obeisance to him. And he comes back down and becomes a sage again. As the deity forms back into the two separate deities again, the goddess Parvati says, all right, I understand now that you want to do nothing with me. You want to do nothing with anything that's feminine. So I will give you this curse. Whatever feminine part of you exists, may it go away, because it's clear you don't need it. And he said, okay, deal, let's do that. So when she curses him, he turns into ashes. And he said, oh my God, what's happened to me? I'm nothing. I can't do anything. I can't move. I can't breathe. I am just the dust of the world. I have become nothing. And she said, exactly. That's what it means to not have me as a part of your life. That's what it means to not have a deeper understanding of the feminine divine in your life. When you don't have me, you have nothing. Just as if you don't have my husband, you don't have anything. And when you don't get told those stories as a kid, and you learn as an adult that there's such a deep relationship between the masculine and the feminine, it becomes a very unfortunate reality for me as a Hindu to realize why there may be so many disparities or ironies that exist within our communities. As a Hindu, I grew up in a family that is conservative, that considered themselves Vaishnavite, or folks that worship the Lord Vishnu, the god of sustenance. They worshipped his various famous manifestations like Ram and Krishna, which are very known within the Western world. They were deep believers in the caste system and very much adapted to those ways without explaining to me why they had any value. And they were also deeply misogynistic in a lot of ways, unfortunately, which were all things that did not sit well with me. And as someone who kind of had a falling out and a crisis with Hinduism, I then came across the reality of the feminine divine as being the center of my universe. And that's what made me change my relationship to my Hinduness, because it actually informed me that there is a way to understand, if everyone understood, that Hinduism is not just about the male goddesses, it is not masculine, it is not toxic, if it is not taught to you that way. And when I began to grow in that relationship, I was able to identify better as an activist. I was able to identify better as a feminist. I was able to identify better as someone who is bisexual. I was able to identify in so many different ways that made me acknowledge the entire person that I am, because I had a better relationship with the divine through the feminine. Now, this doesn't mean that the communities don't have their ironies. Even if there are millions of people that may worship the goddesses, it does not necessarily mean that there is a better relationship towards women. There is still, unfortunately, an irony that sits not so well with me, but not so well with many others who might come from those communities. And when you deal with the dynamic of how Hinduism as theology, as mythology, and as practice in society kind of comes together, it always makes me think about, how are we centering justice? How am I centering the mother goddess through justice? And it meant that in every way for me, being an interfaith activist had to be front and center to do so. I had to address intersectionality in a way that I never thought I would before, because I was actually theologically mandated to do so. The goddess reminds me every day that if my energy exists within you and in all of creation, you're not only responsible for yourself, you're responsible for everything around you. And if you know that there are communities that are being marginalized and oppressed, you have a deeper responsibility to them to make sure that they're uplifted and equalized. And this continues to inform the way that I have a growing, complicated, and kind of painful relationship to my understanding of Hinduism, because I know that I have a deep love and devotion to the mother goddess, but boy, does she know how to test me. Because she puts a lot of obstacles in my way as a reminder of my ability to be able to help make a difference in the world. And in her service lies the welfare of all of creation. So I do what I can to make sure that other people don't have to see me telling them about how important the mother goddess is to me by just telling them about it. I live it through my example of fighting for the justice of others. And with that, I turn it over to everyone for questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Tahil.
And Geneva, the one thing I wanted to say also is please excuse me. I've had a sore throat all day. So if I start losing my voice in the next 15, 20 minutes, like please don't mind. It's nothing personal. It's just personal to me because my throat.
No, you sound great. So thanks everyone. We're going to open up for questions now. I do apologize for the Zoom bombing, but we were able to quickly remove them. It's just one of the unwanted consequences of meeting virtually. But so does anyone have any questions? Don, or yeah?
I do, yes. The chant that we heard referred to the Supreme and the Creator. So that body that's being referred to then, is that half male, half female?
That's a great question, Don. Actually, no. That is referring to the genderless, formless, I think, energy that exists in everything, that makes up everything, that can manifest in ways including being solely male information, solely female information, and, the equal halves information.
That would be then what some of us would refer to as God. It's neither man or woman or of the body, or it's okay.
Exactly, which is why I made the gem reference before, because if people have an affinity with the feminine divine solely, that aspect of the gem appeals to them more than any of the others, and vice versa to any other person that might see it differently as well. But it is the same gem.
One more question, if I may. I noticed that the goddesses are all portrayed with their legs semi-crossed, rather than just standing on both legs. What is the meaning of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that has a deeper relationship to the aspects of yoga. So there are different asanas or positions that various gods and goddesses will be found sitting in that kind of represent the ability for them to, it has a lot to do with the imagery of what they represent. So sitting in the lotus position is supposed to show divinity. It's supposed to show connection to the ground, to nature, Mother Earth, and it's supposed to show the centering of our energies to be able to become manifest or connected with the world around you. And there are many positions that the gods and goddesses sit in and even stand in or even dance in to be able to represent them.
Thank you very much.
And I believe Kaifi has his hand raised.
Yes, thank you for seeing that, Mr. Sharma. Firstly, thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting, especially the parts you mentioned about the Vedas and the Gayatri Mantra. I've heard a few different renditions of that from different musicians too, and a little bit from the Upanishads always interested me too. But I wanted to go back. My question kind of goes back to something you mentioned earlier in your talk about, I think you mentioned you have like both a Sikh background and Hindu. I was very curious how maybe in a spiritual or cultural sense you kind of meld those together or bring those together. I have a little bit of knowledge about Sikh history, and I know it kind of emerged in a context in that its early followers had Muslim backgrounds, Hindu backgrounds. That Guru Nanak did a lot for equality of all people, and like kind of like universal love, and that there's a notion of God like Vaheguru, which is probably kind of like the supreme being you mentioned before. So I was curious, like maybe I've only heard of Sikhs being like just Sikhs, so it's very interesting if there are people of Indian background who can kind of harmonize that. I'd love to hear more about that too.
Yeah, that's a great question, Kaifi. Honestly, I think I am a product of intersection. So my parents gave me this offering of seeing that they bring two different aspects of understanding the divine, and I had a choice of adhering to one of them, adhering to both of them, or adhering to neither of them, because I had the privilege of coming from parents who were very open and accepting of difference, which many folks in my extended family may not necessarily be. And that informed the way that I was able to own the fact that I could come from a dual religious identity. And it continues to mean a lot for me because I'm still learning what that means. I haven't stopped learning what that means to be a Hindu and a Sikh at the same time. A lot of the cultural realities come from the fact that, Sikhism particularly comes from northwestern India. And my family comes from northwestern India, from the state of Punjab. And so there is a lot of shared values and shared culture where folks will find a lot of things in common. So it's not entirely surprising that, communities that are harmonized or communities that are pluralistic in that way will find ways to be able to show that, mutual respect and appreciation for each other during times of joy, during times of sorrow, during times of trying to learn about one another. I think my parents just took it another level by getting married, obviously, and then making me. But with that said, I think it just speaks also to the ever-developing relationship of how religion and spirituality actually are. They don't look the same all the time, and it's still changing over time. And I'm a product of that change because it's given me an opportunity to, actually look more in depth into what I was offered in my faith tradition and make a conscious choice of if I want to commit to them or not. Since I'm not a baptized Sikh, I, for example, don't wear a turban, I don't grow out my hair, but I do wear a kada, which shows my identity as a Sikh. And at the same time, as a Hindu, someone who may not have all of the visible aspects or markings of being a Hindu, still happen to be very involved in how I do that worship and devotion accordingly. So I'm still trying to figure it out. And yeah, it's a process. So I hope that kind of answered your question.
Yes, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Okay. I noticed that all the temples are very ornate, and the Hindu temple that I'm familiar with in Pittsburgh is also very ornate. Okay, so are all the castes invited into the worship space? And who builds the temples?
That's a fantastic question, Becky. Also, good seeing you. So this is where we start getting a little muddy because temples are supposed to be for everyone. At least that's how I grew up understanding it. But the deep realities of the caste system actually very purposefully exclude people of lower caste from being able to pray. And in many occasions, you will find that there are separate entrances for people of different castes. There are separate temples for people of different castes. And there are some communities that will just not allow people who are Dalits or Adivasis to be able to worship along with them whatsoever. And that's an unfortunate reality that exists in many aspects of India, but also might happen, de facto here in the United States without someone explicitly mentioning it. And it has a lot to do with the aspects of the same power dynamics and socioeconomic status that inform the role of caste. And interestingly, a case came up recently on the Northeast coast about a Hindu temple, which is known as the Swaminarayan Temple. There's a chain of them throughout North America and throughout much of the Western world, that they've been accused of hiring Dalits or people from the lowest caste to help build their temples by paying them $1 an hour and not giving them rights and conveniences and comforts and putting them in very terrible situations. And that is supposed to be the irony of how the Brahmins, who are the ones that bring people into the space and say, oh yeah, we're all welcoming, we're all great Hindus, da 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 da, and then pull stunts like this that actually really show some of the deeply privileged nature of how Brahmins as Hindus use their power to be able to still oppress others, even when they're 10,000 miles away from South Asia. So a lot of that is, I think, kind of why, the power struggle in which, the way things function now, I still completely believe that everyone should be able to go to the temple and pray. There's no exception to that. And the fact that there are people who still follow a lot of the social and cultural norms of caste that say that there are exceptions has a lot to do with the generational gap of how we see eye to eye on the role of caste and how it plays out with interpretation of theology and stuff like that.
Wow. Thank you.
Of course.
Did you have another question, Becky, or no? You look like
Yeah,
you're
I had
thinking
another
about
one. I
one.
know. I can't remember what it was.
Well, I haven't left yet, so if you end up thinking of it, I can come right back to you.
Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions? I do see that Candace asked for some recommended reading in the chat if you have any suggestions.
Ah, yes. I'm so sorry, Candace. You did ask that question. I'm sorry I didn't know that. Yeah, honestly, I would need to get back to you all on that because I kind of struggle with trying to find some text myself. Since I have the privilege of being able to, read Sanskrit and do the things that I want to do, I can actually go back into my own texts and read and interpret things and try to understand accordingly. But there are a couple of books on the goddesses that I think are published by Penguin Books that are really good at being able to explain the mother goddess. I might actually send a potential list of maybe a couple I can find to Geneva, who she can then forward it to all of you if possible. I don't want to give you another task, Geneva, and just stop.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I am also a goddess devotee, and I have invoked Kali Ma, and she is transformative. She will change your life, I promise you.
Thank you, Candace. Becky, do you have another question? I see you're
I
gonna.
wanted to ask, I think you said you were going to talk about how the cow became a holy
Yes,
cow
that is absolutely.
in culture. Did you? Yeah.
I did not, and a part of it was me not wanting to. The other part of it was actually, needing to explain the nuance that is actually very connected to the feminine divine as well. So the idea of the cow being sacred is a little more complicated than just calling the cow sacred. It's the idea of the role that the cow plays in Indian society that much of Hindu community has adopted to be very much a model of what compassionate creation looks like, because the cow is seen as sort of the prime example of the animal that gives so much to everyone else and takes nothing in return. So it's seen as an animal of divine proportions because of that. But people don't necessarily worship a cow directly like it is a separate entity. So the sacredness of cows is basically the sacredness of all animal life, understanding that animal life is as sacred as human life, as sacred as divine life. That's the kind of imagery that's supposed to be understood, and that we as human beings, in our connection to the divine, should be like the calf suckling on the teat of the cow. We're supposed to have that kind of relationship.
Okay, and I have one more question. What about service? And as like in a Hindu temple community, what are they inclined to do service, or I don't know anything about that.
That's a great question. So there are various aspects of what we consider yoga that are beyond the physical sort of, exercises or practices that you might see. And a specific practice of yoga called karma yoga actually is an idea that the form of yoga that you do is solely done through service of others. And so there are folks that actually use that practice very vividly as their way of being able to do worship. So I would consider myself someone who does karma yoga because my way of worshiping is through service and through helping people, not necessarily through just worship or just through the physical practice of yoga.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Dorothy, did you have a question? I think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
When you worship, do you worship the feminine divine as a feminine entity, calling, because I heard you call her a she? What do you think about the movement to do away with either masculine or pronoun references in representing divinity and calling them they, and not real? I'm confused. Do you pray to her or do you pray to God, who has two poles, both a feminine and a masculine aspect?
That's a very good question, Dorothy. The answer is yes, because we don't see a separation between everything you just said. By worshiping her, I am worshiping them, I am worshiping him. Because in both the linguistic standard of how things like Hindu theology has sort of developed, but also in regional languages, many times we refer to the divine as them when we have it in scriptures and stuff like that. There may be often times where specific deities will be referred to with specific markers, but since we don't necessarily consider them separate from the ultimate, by worshiping the female form, we are worshiping the genderless form. By worshiping the male form, we're worshiping the genderless form. So there's not necessarily a separation of them.
Were there other questions?
I had one more. I didn't get to raise my hand, but I had one other question, if I may.
Go for it.
Thanks. Yes, I think you mentioned earlier in the talk, like certain denominations of Hinduism, and I've definitely heard the word like Shaktism before. And I think there was, I guess I'm forgetting what, there's like, Smartism. I've heard that one as well, and Kashmiri Shaivism and Vedanta. So I kind of wanted to ask, like, I've sometimes heard it said that Hinduism is like a collection of many belief systems that have certain commonalities, and they have a sort of common origin, or they're traced back to the Vedas, so they can be distinguished in a way from like things like Buddhism and Sikhism and so on. But like, would you be able to say anything about like maybe what kind of unites all these different denominations together, like maybe like what makes something quintessentially Hindu? And also, I know you mentioned Ramakrishna earlier, so I was going to ask whether in Vedanta in particular, there was like certain teachings about the divine feminine there.
Yes, a great set of questions. So to answer your first question about like the shared values of Hindus across the board, that's just really hard. Like I'm gonna honestly say I don't know, because it is literally, the amalgamation is so much that being able to bring all of the different aspects of Hinduism together like puts any scholar to sleep. That's how complicated it is. It's the centering aspects of, I think, what is considered shared as a Hindu mindset or a Hindu society is sort of centered on things like dharma, or sort of your duty towards creation. It's centered on things like the reciprocity of the good and the bad that you put into the world and how it comes to you as karma. There are certain aspects of like what we've become accustomed to, which is the sensory experience of how we worship, that I think accommodate to the idea that that is a very Hindu environment that we create, whether it is, the ringing of bells and lighting of incense and doing the very, robust kind of prayers, or whether it's as simple as sitting within yourself and reading holy text and praying within yourself or meditating. So in that large spectrum, there are some things that can be shared that accordingly can be across the board considered Hindu. To your second question, in connection to the Ramakrishna mission and the Vedanta community, there is definitely a tinge and an emphasis on the mother goddess. One of the main sages after Swami Ramakrishna is Mata. Oh, I can't remember her name right now. But she's considered a very important figure in the Vedanta community. And there are many altars that are created of the goddess Kali in many Vedanta communities. They celebrate what is known as Navratri, which is the festival of the 9 goddesses that takes place in between the months of September and October, where people fast and they pray to the different aspects of the goddess Durga, which a lot of the Vedanta community does, and I do myself as well. And yeah, I hope that answered both of your questions.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry it was so broad.
Oh, no worries at all.
Are there any other questions?
In the meantime, as people might come up with more questions, I will be sure to leave my email and my social media stuff in the chat below so that you can find me. And if you have any additional questions or would like to, talk about anything else, I'm more than happy to do so.
There are other questions or comments before we wrap up?
I think we're good.
Joshua, did you want to share a little bit about your the program you're doing in the Divine Feminine on your podcast before we leave the group? Oh, I think you sent that to me privately instead of to the...
Joshua could mention the name of his podcast and we can always tune in if we're interested.
Looks like he just put it in the chat. So there's that information if you guys are interested.
I just realized I had my mic on mute.
Oh, I was wondering why you were ignoring me.
Yeah, no, I had my mic on mute. I was over here talking. I didn't realize I had it on mute, and here I am. I run a podcast. The name of my podcast is Breaking Reality, and it's on the topics of spirituality, metaphysics, and mysticism. And this Thursday, I'm going to have a guest on. Her name is Lori Kimmerly, and we're going to be doing a discussion on the Divine Feminine as well. We're going to be taking a look at it in several different aspects. We've actually went ahead and booked 2 shows already because we know we're going to go into more context and what we're going to cover in just one show. But the show will be, I do the shows on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so she'll be on this Thursday, June 8th at 7 p.m. Eastern. The link is in the chat. It is Breaking Reality Show. It can be found on YouTube, is where we do the shows live. So there is a chat where you can ask questions and interact as well, just like here. This is something that I'm definitely going to be going into more and more on that show. And I would actually like to talk with Tahil about possibly being a guest on the show as well.
I'd love that.
I appreciate that. Well, let's, I think I actually have some of your contact information from Geneva already, so.
Yeah, look at me just giving out your email address.
I just ratted her out.
Yes, no, but it's a great show, and Joshua and I had a discussion a few weeks back about the Interfaith Center and interfaith work. So definitely check the podcast out. Does anyone else have any comments or questions before we wrap up?
I'm just really so happy to see everybody talking about the Divine Feminine, because for so long it seems that this was something only women talked about and men didn't really go there. So happy to see this. Thank you very much.
Yes, Candace might also be a good candidate for your podcast.
I just have a timeline question, Joshua.
Yeah.
what is your timeline for this divine goddess going back to when? Are you doing the Indo-European? Are you doing the Egyptian? Are you doing the...
With the lady that I'm having the discussion with, Lori, we're probably going to be covering a lot of different aspects of it. So I know that in the personal conversation that I had with her, we discussed basically everything that you just asked about. You know, we've talked about several different aspects of it, because the way that I see the divine feminine is it's spread throughout. You see it represented in every major religion, every major spirituality. There's a divine feminine aspect and a divine masculine aspect, and they have to work in conjunction together. Just like what Tahil was saying, with the way the gods and the goddesses work together, but you can't separate them. They are one. But it's the union and the way that they work together is what you got to be looking at.
Okay, well, I was looking at it through art too when I was trying to track them. And I could find, going back to the Venus of Willendorf, okay? Like, you know, I could go back tens of thousands of years, but I'm not really sure that that is a divine feminine, or if it's just like a woman or a mother. So when exactly did the divine feminine come into being as a concept and as an icon to be worshipped?
I think that may be impossible to answer.
I think Candace might be your best, the best.
First of all, unfortunately, when we can't time travel yet, perhaps we will able to do that at some point in time. But it looks as if this was probably the primordial concept of the sacred. Certainly the figures like the Venus, the various Venuses, there are many, many, many of them. And there are some figurines even older than that. They do not seem to be depictions of actual people, because there's no distinctive facial representation on them, but more representations of an idea, a concept, or a sacredness. And yeah, we will never know for sure. But in most goddess spirituality, we look at the divine feminine as really the primordial, the first expression of the sacred that humans were aware of, as the earth nurtured them.
Thanks, Candace.
And I teach a class on that, if you'd ever like to take it, at the College of Southern Nevada. It's called Goddess Traditions.
I like that this has just become a networking on the divine feminine at this point. I'm glad that we could create this space and are having this conversation. Tahil, did you have anything you wanted to add before we close? No?
No, I don't think so. And now that I've shared my social, if anyone would like to ask anything else or talk about anything, please know that my email and my social media is open.
Thanks so much for doing that. And and I think a lot of people on this call should probably connect. So definitely reach out to each other. Or if you'd like to connect through me, I'm pretty sure everyone has my email. So thank you so much, Tahil, for this wonderful presentation and this oh, Morgan, did you have something before I see a hand just went up. You there, Morgan?
There. I'm sorry, I couldn't unmute myself in time. Technology, I hate it. Anyway, there's a really good book on the divine feminine that I read. It's been, I read it when I was like 10 or 11, and I'm in my 50s. It's been through many, many, many editions, and it probably covers the divine feminine in more depth than anything I've ever seen. And it's called The Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets. And I don't know if Candace knows that.
Yes. The author is Barbara Walker. Yes.
Yeah, it's a great book. It's showing how we started off with the divine feminine, and it's been transmogrified, and our worship of this earth has been transmogrified but that the Christian myth of Jesus is ancient and in ancient cultures. And we just keep recycling the same myths and putting different names on them and forming different religions. And we really are needing to be together in a lot of ways to cross those boundaries, male and female, and in every way. We're a network. This earth is a network communicating together, and to try to separate it out is unnatural and unhealthy and leads to all kinds of sickness and illness as a society. And that's all I wanted to say, because I don't want to sound preachy. Thank you.
I posted one in the chat too, When God Was a Woman by Merlin Stone.
Oh, yeah.
And being the old college prof, I actually do have a bibliography. I'll send it to you, Geneva.
Great. Yeah. If you want to send that to me, and then Tahil, you can send me your list when you compile that. I'll send that out to everyone who registered. So, all right, great. Well, we are about 20 after at this point, so I'm not going to keep you any longer, but thank you all so much for being here and being part of this conversation. And thank you, Tahil, for your wonderful presentation. So have a good evening, everyone.